July 1943. While the world fixed its eyes on Kursk and the greatest armored clash in history, another battle savage, anonymous, and just as bloody raged along the banks of the Mius River in the heart of the Donetsk Basin. Germans and Soviets fought tooth and nail over an insignificant river with equal ferocity and equal bloodshed. It was a war without glory, far from newspaper headlines and camera lenses. Only men dying, and other men stepping into the places they left behind. I was there. My name is Carl Hendrickson, born in Rotterdam in 1919, son of a docker and a seamstress. I volunteered for the Waffen-SS in April 1941, like many young Dutchmen who believed in the idea of a united Germanic Europe or simply wanted to escape the grayness of occupation. By the summer of 1943, I had already survived 2 years on the Eastern Front since the first day of Operation Barbarossa. I had passed through Galicia and Ukraine, the fighting along the Don near Dnipropetrovsk, the frozen winter of 1941 before Rostov, the Caucasus campaign of 1942 with the advance on Grozny and Malgobek, and the retreating battles along the Monik and the Don after the collapse at Stalingrad. I had seen things a human being should not see, and done things I will never speak of. The war had changed me, as it changes every man who survives to tell of it. At the start of the Mius fighting, I commanded a platoon of 16 men in the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion, SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Westland, 5th SS Panzergrenadier Division Wiking. Half were recruits who had arrived in spring and were still growing accustomed to the rawness of war. Of the 8 veterans, 3 were Dutch like me, 2 were Flemish, from around Antwerp. 2 were ethnic Germans from the Romanian Banat, and 1 was a German from Silesia who had served in the Wehrmacht before transferring to the SS. A heterogeneous group, just as the entire Wiking Division was heterogeneous Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Dutch, Flemish, Finns, Estonians, and ethnic Germans from half of Europe. We spoke different languages and prayed to different gods, but we had learned to fight together and survive together. That was what mattered. On 17 July, the Soviet Southern Front, under General Fyodor Tolbukhin, launched the offensive with approximately 270,000 soldiers, 737 armored vehicles, and the air cover of the 8th Air Army against the skeletal deployment of the German 6th Army along the Mius line. The strategic objective was Stalino, the coal capital of the Donets, and beyond it the Dnieper. The operation aimed to pin down German reserves and prevent any transfer of reinforcements to Kursk. 3 Soviet armies, the 28th, the 5th Shock, and the 2nd Guards, reinforced by the 2nd and 4th Guards mechanized corps, were to tear open the German front and advance westward without delay. In just 48 hours, the Soviets established a bridgehead 35 kilometers wide and 6 deep in the vicinity of the villages of Stepanovka and Marinovka in the ravine country. The 16th Panzergrenadier Division and the 23rd Panzer Division of the 6th Army held on with difficulty, suffering heavy casualties. The 16th Panzergrenadier lost 24 armored vehicles destroyed in 2 days, with another 40 requiring repair. The situation had become critical. To prevent catastrophe, the experienced divisions of 2 SS Panzer Corps were withdrawn from the Kursk sector and transferred south. The SS divisions Totenkopf and Das Reich, which had just endured the bloodiest fighting at Prokhorovka, together with the 3rd Panzer Division and our own Wiking Division, received the mission of halting the Soviet advance and eliminating the bridgehead. Our division had been kept in reserve during the Kursk fighting and had not participated directly in Operation Citadel. SS Brigadier Herbert Gill, who had assumed command on 1 May in place of SS Oberfuhrer Felix Steiner, had used the period to reorganize and re-equip the troops. We received reinforcements, new equipment, vehicles, and ammunition. In spring, the Estonian Volunteer Battalion Narwa had joined the division, replacing the Finnish Volunteer Battalion that had returned to Finland. By Eastern Front standards, we were reasonably well supplied, well below theoretical strength, but that was what there was. The 3rd Company numbered 112 men that day, under the command of SS Hauptsturmführer Heinrich Foch, an experienced officer from Hanover who had served with the division since the start of the Russian campaign and had been wounded in the Caucasus. Under his orders acted 4 platoon leaders, all non-commissioned officers with combat experience. The Westland Regiment totaled around 2,000 soldiers, distributed among 3 battalions of 3 companies each, plus support and supply units. The 1st Battalion, to which we belonged, occupied the most forward position in the direction of the combat zone. Day and night, the dull thunder of artillery could be heard in the distance, and we all knew our turn was approaching. On 28 July, we were still in the concentration area, northeast of Stalino, near a locality called Makivka. The village had been largely destroyed. Most of its inhabitants had fled or been deported. We settled among the ruins of a kolkhoz, surrounded by rusting tractors and tumble-down barns waiting for orders. The days in the concentration area were scorching and dusty. July in the Donets is merciless. Temperatures exceeded 35 degrees during the day. The sun blazed from a cloudless sky, and the air shimmered over the fields. Uniforms clung to the body, soaked in sweat that never dried, only aged and grew more acrid. The dust worked its way into everything between the teeth, on the eyelids, in the folds of the wrists. Whoever was not accustomed to chewing dust learned to do so there. We spent the hours in the shade of the ruins, sleeping, playing cards, writing letters that might never reach their destination. The military mail was running poorly that summer. The men spoke little about what was coming. We all knew. In the stomach, the waiting settled like a heavy, inert stone that neither food nor sleep could dissolve. We had heard accounts of what Das Reich and Totenkopf had suffered at Prokhorovka, of how the Soviet armored armies had thrown themselves upon the German positions. Kursk had been a defeat, even though the propaganda claimed otherwise. We all felt that something had changed, that the war had entered a new phase 1 in which we were no longer the attackers, but the defenders. On the afternoon of 28 July, I sat with Rottenfahrer Peter Dries at the entrance to our shelter, and we smoked. Dries was a lean man with angular features, nearly 30 years old, from a village south of Amsterdam. We had met during training in Munich and had fought together ever since through everything the previous 2 years had brought, good and bad. He was one of the few survivors of the original group from our company that had crossed the Soviet border in June 1941. A good soldier, trustworthy, calm under fire, with a dry humor that never left him even in the hardest situations. He was my best friend to the extent that on the front line it is possible to speak of friendship. The sun was dying on the horizon, tinting the sky red and orange. To the east there were flashes the fire of gun muzzles, the flicker of impacts. Dries said it would be beautiful if not for the sound of the cannons. I agreed. The Ukrainian steppe had a raw beauty, the endless fields, the gentle hills, the villages with their whitewashed houses and the golden domes of the churches. But the war had poisoned everything. The fields were mined, the villages destroyed, the people fled or dead. We were sitting in the middle of a dead landscape, waiting to die or to kill. On the morning of 29 July at 04:00, we were placed on alert. The field kitchen had barely begun distributing breakfast coffee and hard bread when the messenger arrived with the order: assemble immediately at the rendezvous point, prepare to march, full equipment. In less than 20 minutes, the company was formed up before the ruins of the kolkhoz. The men were tired and drowsy, but no one complained. We all understood what it meant. Hauptsturmfreierfolk gathered the platoon leaders and non-commissioned officers and set out the situation. SS Brigadier Gill had received the order to move the division immediately south. The Soviet bridgehead on the Mius had reached alarming proportions. The 5th Shock Army and elements of the 2nd Guards Army had broken through the German lines and threatened to roll up the entire Mius front. Hill 213-9, the dominant feature between the ravines of Gerasimka and the surrounding high ground, had fallen into Soviet hands. From there, the Soviets controlled all the terrain as far as the Snezhno-Kubyshevo road. If the bridgehead were not eliminated, the entire southern German front risked collapse. Embarkation into the lorries took place at around 0800. The divisional column stretched for several kilometers, hundreds of vehicles. Opel Blitz, Leasingnag, requisitioned French and Soviet lorries, Kabelwagen, motorcycles, artillery tractors, armored personnel carriers, ambulances. We crammed ourselves with all our equipment into the bed of an Opel Blitz, 16 men per vehicle, wedged in, weapons between the knees, packs stuffed under the benches. The column set off, vehicle after vehicle, an endless serpent of steel and rubber winding along the dusty road southwest. We crossed the Donets Basin, passing coal mines with their characteristic extraction towers and mounds of black slag, abandoned factories with cold and empty chimneys pointing at the sky, carbonized colossi. The marks of war were omnipresent. Bridges destroyed and hastily repaired by the pioneers, burnt-out hulks of vehicles on the road shoulders, Soviet T-34s, German Panzer IVs. Lorries of every kind blackened skeletons of metal, bomb craters converted into muddy pools, fallen telegraph poles with wires hanging down, and everywhere open graves at the roadside, small mounds of packed earth with wooden crosses or steel helmets on top. The heat in the open bed of the lorry was unbearable. The dust raised by the vehicles ahead settled on our uniforms, in our eyes, in our lungs. We wrapped rags around our mouths and noses, scraps of shirts kept for that purpose, but it did little good. By the end of the day, we were all gray with dust, coughing, gasping, eyes burning. The canteens emptied quickly, and fresh water only came at night. Some men tried to sleep, but the shaking and the heat made that nearly impossible. We crossed columns of civilians, fleeing westward away from the front old women, with handcarts loaded with whatever they had managed to save, children with vacant stares running alongside the vehicles, scattered men too old or too young or too sick to fight. They stepped onto the verge as our column passed and stood watching us as we moved on. Some waved, others turned their backs. What they thought I do not know. Perhaps they hoped we would stop the Soviets. Perhaps they hated us for having brought the war to their homes. It did not matter. We kept moving. At around 18 in the evening, we arrived at the concentration area south of Amvrosievka. The lorries stopped, and we jumped from the beds, stiff and exhausted after 10 hours of travel. Before us stretched a landscape of gentle hills, fields still sown with sunflowers and maize, scattered corpses in the distance. A village with an Orthodox church whose golden dome gleamed in the setting sun. Behind, on the horizon, columns of smoke could be seen, black and dense. The front, the war. The 6th Army's artillery was already firing on the Soviet positions. The booming of the guns was clearly audible, a continuous rumble like a distant thunderstorm that refused to pass. The ground shook with the impacts. From time to time, flares rose into the air and drifted slowly down on their parachutes, bathing the battlefield in a spectral, trembling light. On the southeastern horizon, red and orange flashes, followed by the muffled thud of explosions. The sky above the front was covered by clouds of smoke. We spent the night in shallow depressions on the edge of a sunflower field. The stalks rose above us to head height and gave us some cover from enemy air observation. It smelled of dry earth and the faint, sweet fragrance of sunflowers with that background layer of oil and engine smoke that had permeated the uniforms and would never leave. The Soviets had air superiority in that sector. Their ground attack aircraft bombed German columns and positions daily. We dug in as best we could in the short time available shallow holes that barely offered protection, but were always better than nothing. The ground was hard and dry. The spade grated on stones underneath. The palms burned after just a few minutes. That night, no one slept much. The men sat in groups, smoked, talked in low voices. Some prayed. Some wrote farewell letters to their families. Most simply stared into the darkness, waiting for dawn. I went from man to man, checked equipment, answered questions, tried to convey a confidence I did not myself feel. An Unterscharfer must appear strong even when he is just as frightened as the others. Near midnight, SS Oberscharfer Brinkmann came to me, the first platoon leader in our company. A tall and powerfully built man from Flensburg, already past 30, a professional soldier since the 1930s, a non-commissioned officer in the first SS elite units before the Waffen-SS even existed. One of the most experienced men in the entire division. He sat down next to me and asked if I had tobacco. I gave him my last cigarette, a French Gauloise I had been saving for weeks. He lit it, drew deeply, and looked out into the night. After some time, he said that the next day was going to be hard. The information reaching us from the front was negative. The Russians had dug in deeply minefields, anti-tank positions, buried tanks. Das Reich and Totenkopf had already suffered heavy losses. I merely nodded. What was there to say? It was going to be hard. It was always hard. We would do what had to be done, and at the end we would see who was still standing. That was the war. The 30th of July, 1943, began with a Soviet air attack on our concentration areas. It was around 040 in the morning. The eastern horizon was still only faintly gray, the first birds beginning to chirp, when we heard the characteristic roar of aircraft engines, not the high, steady hum of German machines, but the deeper, irregular rumble of the Soviet Ilyushin Il-2s. The Sturmovix we called the Black Death for their paint scheme and what they were capable of doing. They came in at low level, less than 200 meters altitude, skimming the treetops, and opened fire before we had time to react. I shouted to my men to take cover. We threw ourselves into the depressions and ditches, pressed flat against the earth, while the aircraft's onboard weapons chattered and 23 mm rounds tore up the ground. Then the bombs, the whistle of the descent, the seconds of silence, the deafening crash of impact. Clouds of earth flew through the air. Shrapnel hissed. Someone started screaming a high, thin sound that would not stop. I pressed my face into the mud, felt the cold, damp earth against my cheek, inhaled the smell of gunpowder and burning metal. My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy as leather with that bitter metallic taste that came from the smoke or from fear. Probably both. The seconds stretched until they seemed like hours. With each bomb that fell, I contracted and waited for it to be the end. But the end had not come yet. The aircraft pulled away and banked in the distance for a second pass. In the brief interval between attacks, I looked around. 2 men from the 2nd platoon were lying on the ground, both wounded. One of them, the young ethnic German from Transylvania, called Friedrich Hoffmann, had shrapnel in the abdomen. He was on his back, hands pressed against the wound, blood running between his fingers. He was crying out in pain with that shrill, piercing shriek that echoed in our ears. Senator Hans Kramer, An older man from Bremen, who had been a civilian nurse, ran to him, tore open his first aid kit, and began to stabilize him. But I could tell from Kramer's expression that the situation was serious. Abdominal wounds were almost always fatal at the front, where there were no proper hospitals. The Sturmovix returned for a second pass, this time even lower, heading directly for our position. The air was saturated with engine noise and the crack of their weapons. I raised my head slightly and saw one of them hit by the divisional anti-aircraft battery. 20-millimeter tracer rounds buried themselves in the fuselage, and black smoke poured from the engine. The aircraft entered a spin, tilted to the left, and came down behind a rise. A column of fire. Then, black smoke. The others 4 or 5 broke away, pursued by the tracer rounds from our anti-aircraft guns. Then, silence. We gathered and counted the damage. 2 wounded in my platoon. No dead yet. Friedrich Hoffmann died half an hour later, before the ambulance arrived. He was 19 years old and had been with the unit for only 4 weeks, his first and last engagement. Kramer covered his face with a tarpaulin and noted his name and identity disc number for the casualty report. There was no time for grief. The attack was to begin in less than 2 hours. At 0050, the German artillery preparation opened fire. More than 200 guns and rocket launchers from the 6th Army and the reinforcing division's 10 cm field guns, heavy 15 cm howitzers, 21 cm mortars. Nebelwerfer unloaded on the Soviet positions at Stepanovka, Marinovka, and Gerasimka. The ground heaved underfoot. The eastern horizon lit up orange and red as if someone had set a gigantic bonfire alight. The impacts merged into a continuous roar that overwhelmed everything else, resonated in the ears, and made thought impossible. We stood in our holes and depressions, watching the spectacle. Even after 2 years of war, that release of fire and steel was still impressive. Das Reich was to attack Stepanovka from the north and northeast, with support from elements of the 3rd Panzer Division. Totenkopf would advance further north against Hill 213-9 and the village of Gerasimka, where the Soviets had entrenched with particular tenacity. Our Wiking Division initially formed the reserve of the assault group to advance once the Soviet lines had been broken, to exploit the success, and to deal with any flank counterattacks. SS Brigadier Gill had established his command post in a village a few kilometers from the front, directing operations by radio and dispatch riders. At about 0600, the artillery fell silent for a few minutes to advance the impact points, and the infantry attacked. From a slight rise where we were positioned, we could observe the battlefield. The armor of the 3rd Panzer Division rolled toward the Soviet lines, Panzer IVs, with their long guns escorted by armored personnel carriers full of infantry. Their silhouettes stood out against the hazy sky. Further north, the Tigers of the Totenkopf SS Heavy Company advanced ponderously, massive and slow, their 88 mm guns dominating the whole field. The clatter of tracks mixed with the roar of engines and the renewed fire of the artillery into a single cacophony of war. The Soviet artillery replied immediately. Impacts among the advancing troops, fountains of earth and smoke, black columns where vehicles were struck. I saw in the distance an armored vehicle burning, orange flames licking at the turret. Then a second. The Soviets had set up strong anti-tank positions on the crests and were firing from well-camouflaged positions with 57 mm and 76 mm guns. To this were added the buried T-34s, their turrets barely visible above ground level, capable of penetrating even the Tigers at close range with their 76 mm guns. We waited. The minutes became hours. The sun rose. The heat increased. The roar of battle fluctuated with the progress of the fighting. Rumors circulated, brought by dispatch riders, and wounded men evacuated to the rear. Das Reich had penetrated the northern edge of Stepanovka, but was entangled in violent street fighting. The Russians were defending every house. Totenkopf had attacked Hill 213.9 and become pinned down in the minefields, 48 armored vehicles destroyed in a single day, including 8 Tigers and 800 infantry casualties. The Soviet defense had been far more solid than expected. The anti-tank positions had overlapping fields of fire. At around 0800, we finally received the order to advance. A dispatch rider arrived from the regimental command post with the mission. The Westland Regiment was to reinforce the left flank of the attack on Stepanovka. Das Reich had reached the northeastern edge of the village, but was stalled in heavy street fighting. The Soviets had turned the village into a fortress. Every house was a strong point with machine guns and snipers. Every cellar a bunker stocked with ammunition and rations for days. Every street a fire lane. Anti-tank guns were dug into earthen positions and fired at point-blank range on the attacking armor. The division urgently needed support, and we were the ones to provide it. We marched at quick pace eastward through a dry stream bed that gave us some protection from enemy observation and direct fire. The company advanced in a long column, man behind man, spaced 3 to 5 meters apart to minimize casualties in case of an artillery strike. The heat was unbearable. Sweat ran in rivulets, soaking the uniforms, stinging the eyes. The equipment carbine or machine gun, 6 magazines, 4 stick grenades, gas mask, spade, canteen, ration pouch, ground sheet grew heavier with every meter. The men gasped, but no one fell behind. Ahead of us lay Stepanovka, and beyond it the enemy waited. To our left we heard the crack of tank guns and the chatter of machine guns, the bark of hand grenades, the shouts of men. The fight for Stepanovka was at its height. Behind us, columns of smoke rose from the village, black and dense. The houses were burning. The smell of burning wood and flesh permeated the air that sweet, nauseating odor one never forgets. At around 090, we reached our attack assembly position. We were on the edge of a shallow ditch, a dry irrigation channel about 400 meters from the first houses of Stepanovka. Before us stretched open ground, a harvested wheat field, the stubble gleaming yellow and brown in the sun. Beyond lay the Soviet positions, trenches scarring the ground like brown wounds, machine gun nests behind sandbag barriers, earthen parapets with artillery pieces behind them, and beyond that, the first houses of Stepanovka, low Ukrainian rural dwellings with whitewashed walls and thatched roofs, now blackened and smoldering. Hauptsturmführer came to us with the other platoon leaders and the company's sergeants. He knelt behind a mound of earth and unfolded a map, which he weighted down with stones. He spoke in a low, calm voice, but the artillery fire in the distance swallowed half his words. I caught fragments. Left flank, southwest, 2nd Company. The essentials reached everyone. The 3rd Company was to attack through the left sector from the southwest, with the 2nd Company on our right. The 1st Battalion of the Germania Regiment would attack simultaneously further north to pin the Soviet flank and prevent any withdrawal. We had the support of 3 assault guns from the SS battery positioned on a rise behind us. The artillery would make one more pass 5 minutes before the assault. Then the fire would be lifted. Then we would go. I looked at my men. Dries was sitting next to me, checking his machine gun. Kramer, the medic, had his dressing kit at hand. The others were in their holes, faces gray with dust and tension, eyes on the Soviet positions. Some moved their lips, perhaps they were praying. Others stared into the void. In a few minutes we would rise and run toward death. That was the war. There were no heroes, only men doing what had to be done. The attack began at 10:00. The assault guns opened fire on the Soviet machine gun nests while the artillery fired its last salvos. The impacts blew large gaps in the open ground before us, raised earth and smoke, covering us for a few moments. Then the fire fell silent, and Hauptsturmführer leapt to his feet and shouted the order to attack. We rose. I shouted to my men to move forward fast. Don't stop. The first to stop are the first to die. We ran as fast as we could across the open field. I saw only the ground before me, the stubble grating under the boots, the clods I leapt over. Beside me ran Dries, Kramer, the others 100 men running in the open toward death. We covered the first 100 meters in a sprint before the Soviets reacted. I ran and barely felt the ground beneath my feet. My mouth was parched, my throat closed. No saliva, only dust and that taste of copper that always came when the heart was beating too fast. Then the Soviet machine guns opened fire, the characteristic hammering of the Maxims, a heavy, regular pounding the whistle of the bullets, the hiss as they passed close to the head. Gefreiter Wilhelm Miller, a young ethnic German from Transylvania, who had been with us for only 6 weeks, was running at my side. He was hit in the chest and fell. I heard him cry out and saw from the corner of my eye how he dropped. But there was no time to stop. We kept going. The next minutes fused into a single chaos of noise, dust, and mortal terror. Grenades fell, throwing up clouds of earth and stones. Men dropped one by one, cut down by bullet or shrapnel. Shouts mixed with the din of weapons. I threw myself behind a mound of earth, the edge of a crater from a previous impact, and fired my machine gun at a trench 30 meters away. The magazine emptied in seconds. I changed it, fired again. I saw one of the Soviets slump, then another. Dries crouched at my side, his face gray with dust and tension, but his hands steady. He pulled a fresh stick grenade from his pocket, a steel hand grenade, with its characteristic long wooden handle, and nodded at me. I understood. I would cover with fire while he threw. I raised the machine gun and opened fire on the Soviet position. Dries rose, drew back his arm, and threw. The grenade traced an arc through the air, 5 seconds in flight, and exploded directly in the Russian trench. Shouts, smoke, silence. We advanced and jumped into the trench. Inside, 3 Soviet soldiers lay dead, torn apart by the explosion. A 4th was trying to flee, crawling along the bottom of the trench toward the east. Dries killed him with his pistol, 2 shots in the back. The man collapsed, gave a brief shudder, and lay still. We worked our way along the trench northward, crouched, weapons at the ready. The walls were shored up with planks, the floor covered with straw and boards. The Russians had been there since the breakthrough on 17 July, already weeks. Everywhere there were spent shell casings, tins of food with Cyrillic characters, scraps of meals, torn letters, photographs. I stepped on the image of a woman with a child, a faded black and white photograph. Someone's mother, someone's wife. The man to whom it had belonged was probably lying somewhere in the trench, dead or dying. I kept going. At the end of the trench, we came upon a machine gun position. 2 Soviet soldiers were operating a Maxim, firing on our comrades in the open ground. They had not heard us coming, too busy loading and firing. Dries and I approached from behind, crouched, weapons aimed. I signaled to him, raised 3 fingers 3 seconds. He nodded. I threw a hand grenade. The explosion was deafening in that narrow space. The first Russian was hurled backward, his body torn apart. The second turned around, face bloodied, and tried to grab his pistol. Dries was faster 3 shots from the Luger, and the man fell. By midday, we had taken the first Soviet trench line. The company regrouped in the captured positions in the trenches and holes that until recently had belonged to the enemy. Dries let himself slide down the trench wall, and fished from the pocket of a dead Russian a half-crushed Makora cigarette. He sniffed it, shrugged, and placed it in his mouth. He said that when one has the luck to survive, it is only fair to enjoy life's small pleasures. I told him the cigarette belonged to a dead man. He replied that the dead man no longer needed it, but he did. The logic was undeniable. Hauptsturm für Folk counted the casualties. 21 men were missing. 7 had died, their bodies scattered across the field we had crossed. The other 14 were wounded, some seriously, others more lightly. Wilhelm Miller was dead. Oberscharfer Brinkmann was still alive, but a sniper had hit him as he tried to help a wounded man. The bullet had destroyed his right shoulder. He was carried away on a stretcher, his face white with shock and blood loss. I never saw him again. Still ahead of us were about 200 meters to the first houses of Stepanovka. The Soviets had withdrawn into the buildings and were firing from windows and cellar openings. A Soviet armored vehicle, a T-34, was waiting behind a destroyed barn, its turret barely visible above the ruins, bombarding our positions with its 76 gun. The impacts threw up fountains of earth. One of our assault guns, a Stug G-3 with its 75 gun, was dueling with it. Shot and countershot the crack of the cannons, the whistle of the shells. The two vehicles fired several times without hitting. Then a German round struck the side of the T-34's turret. The tank did not explode, but smoke poured from the turret, and the crew tried to evacuate. The hatches opened. The men jumped out. We shot them down one by one. The second vehicle, which had been following behind, saw what had happened and reversed into the darkness. In the middle of the afternoon, we received reinforcements from elements of the Germania Regiment, about 150 men under the command of SS Obersturmbannführer Hack, commander of the 2nd Germania Battalion. Together, we were to continue the attack on the center of the village. Hack was an experienced officer. Tall, lean, his face marked by scars, his eyes gray and cold, who had fought with the division since the first day of the Russian campaign. The men trusted him. He knew what he was doing. At 14 Toe, we advanced again. This time we fought house by house, street by street, methodical and bloody work. Each building had to be assaulted individually. The Soviets defended every room, every cellar, every attic. We threw grenades through windows, kicked down doors, fired into dark rooms without knowing who was inside. Hand-to-hand combat was brutal and without mercy. There were no prisoners in the first hours. Whoever moved was shot down. In one of the houses, a 2-story brick building, whitewashed on the outside, I came upon a Soviet officer. He was sitting at a table bent over maps when I came through the door. He looked up, his eyes widened, and his hand went instinctively to his pistol. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw his eyes brown, wide open, full of fear and determination. He was perhaps 30 years old, wearing the uniform of a Red Army lieutenant. Then I fired. The machine gun clattered, and he fell, hit by at least 5 rounds in the chest and abdomen. He was dead before he could raise his weapon. On the table was a map. I took it, folded it, and stuffed it in my pocket. I handed it later to Hauptsturm für Folk, who forwarded it to the regimental staff. It was a detailed map of the German position system with the locations of artillery pieces and command posts. Soviet intelligence was well informed. It was not good news, but it explained the accuracy of their artillery. The fighting continued until nightfall. We took about half of Stepanovka, house by house, street by street. Das Reich was fighting in the northern part of the village on our right. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Our company had been reduced from 112 to 77 men. The first platoon, which had been Brinkmann's, had virtually ceased to exist. Of its original 32 men, 11 remained fit to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. When the sun set and darkness descended over the battlefield, we dug in the captured houses. That night, no one slept. We sat in cellars and ground floors, weapons in hand, waiting for the Soviet counterattack. It would come. It always came. The first attack came at 23:00. Soviet assault groups, about 50 men, tried to retake the houses on the eastern edge of the village. We heard them coming, the clink of equipment, muffled voices, curses in Russian, feet striking the hard ground. Then they shouted "Ura" and came on with a rush. We opened fire from the windows and doorways. Grenades flew back and forth. Machine guns chattered. Tracer rounds traced orange lines in the darkness. In 10 minutes, it was over. The Soviets withdrew, leaving behind about 20 dead. The second attack came at around 010, stronger than the first, about 100 men with mortar support whose impacts broke through the roofs of the houses. This time, they came closer, to within a few meters of our positions, some even entering the buildings. In the house my platoon was defending a low farmhouse with thick walls and small windows. We fought room by room. A Soviet soldier jumped through a broken window and landed directly in front of me. I shot him from the hip before he could raise his rifle. His face was young, perhaps 18 years old, with a faint down on his chin and wide-open eyes. He fell back through the window and hung on the sill, half inside, half outside, blood dripping onto the floor. The third attack came around 03:00, and it came with armor. 2 T-34s advanced down the village street, tracks grinding on the cobblestones, engines roaring. They fired on the houses where we were, the 76 mm rounds punching through walls and tearing open large gaps. In the flash of the shots, I could see their dark silhouettes, massive and lethal machines. We had no more anti-tank weapons. The Panzerfaust were exhausted, the Haftladungen spent. I thought it was the end. Then Dries did something I will never forget as long as I live. He grabbed a Haftladung we had taken from a dead pioneer, a magnetic mine that adhered to armor. He ran, went out into the darkness, straight at the first tank. I shouted at him to come back, but he either did not hear me or did not want to. He jumped onto the rear of the T-34, clung on as the tank advanced, and fixed the charge to the engine compartment. Then he jumped and threw himself to the ground. The explosion destroyed the T-34's tracks. The tank spun in a circle, with one track broken, and came to a halt. The crew tried to escape. The hatches opened. The men came out. We shot them down one by one. The second T-34, which was following behind, saw what had happened and reversed, disappearing into the darkness. Dries came back to us, his face black with soot, his uniform torn but unharmed. He was shaking from head to toe, the adrenaline slowly draining away. I wanted to shake his hand, to tell him he was the bravest man I knew, but I found no words. Later, I proposed him for the Iron Cross First Class. He received it at the end of the fighting. On 31 July, with the first light of day, we resumed the attack. The Soviets were exhausted, their reserves consumed by the nocturnal incursions. House by house, the resistance diminished compared with the previous day. By midday, all of Stepanovka was in our hands. But the price had been heavy. The Westland Regiment had lost more than 300 men in 2 days. Das Reich had suffered similar losses, perhaps greater. The Totenkopf Division was still fighting for Hill 213-9 and had lost 48 armored vehicles, including 8 Tigers, and at least 800 infantry. The Soviet defense had been far more tenacious than anyone had expected, but the breakthrough was made. On 1 August, the Soviet units began to withdraw. The pressure on their flanks had become unbearable. E-2nd SS Panzer Corps pressed from the north. The 3rd Panzer Division from the east. 5 Soviet divisions were encircled or destroyed. Thousands of prisoners poured into our lines, exhausted, ragged men. They had fought for days on end without adequate supply, without ammunition, without food. Their eyes were hollow, their movements mechanical. Some wept, some cursed. Most said nothing. We directed them westward to the collection points. What happened to them there? I do not know. I did not want to know. On 2nd August 1943, we returned to the banks of the Mius. The German positions had been recovered. The Soviet bridgehead no longer existed. We stood on the banks of the small river and looked east where the Soviets were regrouping for the next attack. The Mius flowed tranquilly, less than 30 meters wide, the water murky and slow. It was hard to believe that so many men had died for that patch of earth. But that was the war. Men died for hills and rivers, for villages and crossroads, for points on a map that no one would remember a year later. The Wiking Division had lost in 4 days, fighting more than 800 men between killed, wounded, and missing. The Westland Regiment still counted about 1,500 soldiers, down from 2,000 at the start. Our 3rd Company had 61 men, down from 112. From my platoon of the original 16 men, 7 remained, including myself. 7 had fallen. 2 were so seriously wounded that they would never return. Oberscharfer Brinkmann, Gefreiter Miller, Rottenfer Vandenberg, Schütze Janssen, Schütze Petersen, Schütze Hoffmann, Schütze Schneider. Names I will not forget as long as I live. The Westland Regiment suffered between 30 July and 2nd August 358 casualties, 112 killed, 206 wounded, 40 missing. The total casualties of the 6th Army in the Mius fighting between 10 July and 10 August were 3,298 killed, 15,817 wounded, and 2,254 missing. Soviet casualties were far higher. According to German sources, the 6th Army took 17,762 prisoners during that fighting. But the Soviets could replace their losses. We could not. In the days that followed, we were transferred to a quieter sector of the front for rest and reorganization. The pioneers reinforced the positions, laid new minefields, built shelters and communication trenches. The artillery took up new fire positions and settled in. New reinforcements arrived, young lads, most of them under 20 years old. Most were ethnic Germans from Romania and Hungary, from the Banat in Transylvania. They barely spoke German and understood little of what awaited them. We tried to train them as much as the little time available allowed how to clean a weapon, how to seek cover, how to dig a trench, how to survive. SS Brigadier Gill was proposed for the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross for his leadership of the division in the Mius fighting. He received them on 1 November as the 315th recipient from the hands of the Frere at the Rastenburg headquarters. The distinction honored his performance during the hard fighting, but for us at the front, it changed nothing. We kept on fighting as we always had. On 3 August, a new Soviet offensive broke out further north near Belgorod and Kharkov Operation Rumyantsev, named after an 18th century Russian field marshal. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps was transferred north again to close the breach. The Totenkopf and Das Reich divisions moved out, exhausted and decimated, but still with fighting capacity. We remained for now on the Mius, holding the sector with what was left of us. Today is 7 August 1943. I am sitting in a shelter on the western bank of the Mius, writing these lines by candlelight. The air inside is heavy and damp, smelling of wet earth, tobacco smoke, and the men sleeping here. The pencil is worn down, the fingers hardened from all the digging and gripping of weapons. The candle casts a small trembling circle of light, and beyond it, the darkness. The sun set an hour ago, and the darkness covers the river valley. To the east I hear the distant rumble of Soviet artillery, a persistent roar like far-off thunder. Tomorrow, or the day after, they will attack again. The scouts are reporting troop concentrations on the eastern bank. Fresh units. Fresh armor. It is only a matter of time. Yesterday, we received 32 reinforcements, young lads, most under 20. They come from training centers in Germany and have never seen the enemy, never fired at something that fires back. Their faces are clean and new, their uniforms new, their expressions curious and frightened at the same time. It falls to me to familiarize them with the terrain, to show them how to survive. I do not know how to put into words what 2 years of war have taught me. Dries is sitting next to me, cleaning his rifle as he does every night. He does it methodically, piece by piece, disassembles the weapon, cleans each part with an oiled rag, reassembles it. It is his way of dealing with fear, with uncertainty, with waiting. Everyone has their method. Kramer prays. I hear him sometimes at night when he thinks no one is listening. Some write letters that will never arrive. Some drink when there is something to drink. Some simply sit staring into the void and waiting. The new men, the reinforcements who arrived yesterday, are gathered in a corner of the shelter, whispering. They are afraid. I see it in their faces, in the way they lean against one another like sheep before a thunderstorm. They wonder about what is coming, about what it will be like when the Soviets attack. They have heard stories from other soldiers, from wounded men who passed through the hospital, stories of hand-to-hand combat, of bayonets and rifle butts, of tanks rolling over trenches and crushing the men inside. They do not know whether the stories are true. Most of them are true. Some are even worse than the stories. I ought to speak to them, raise their spirits, tell them everything will turn out well. But I cannot lie. Not anymore. Not after what I have seen. So I leave them in peace and hope they learn to survive as we all learned. Most will not manage it. That is the statistical truth of war. Of 100 reinforcements who arrive at the front, perhaps 30 survive the first year. Of those 30, perhaps 10 survive the second year, and so on until no one remains. The Mius fighting has shown me once more the fragility of life, how everything can end in an instant. Wilhelm Muller, who was still running at my side on the morning of 30 July, was dead by midday. Oberscharfer Brinkmann, who had given me the last cigarette the night before, was 24 hours later on a stretcher with his shoulder destroyed, heading for a hospital from which no one knew if he would emerge. And all the others, whose names I have written down so they will not be forgotten, Vandenberg from Antwerp, who always talked about his fiancée. Jansen from Rotterdam, who played cards like no one else. Peterson from Copenhagen, who wanted to be a cook after the war. Hoffman from the Banat, who had been with us for only 4 weeks. Schneider from Silesia, who could distill the finest schnapps from whatever he found. All dead. All gone. Buried somewhere in the Ukrainian steppe in graves that no one will ever find. Sometimes I ask myself why I am still alive. Why me and not one of the others? I am no braver, no more intelligent, no faster. I simply had luck until now. The bullets passed by, the shrapnel missed, the grenades fell elsewhere. That is all. Luck, chance, there is no higher meaning in it, no divine providence protecting me. Only chance, and chance can change at any moment. The artillery on the eastern bank of the Mius has started firing again. I hear the dull rumble, the whistle of shells in the distance, the crash of impact somewhere south of us. They are hitting our neighbors, the 336th Infantry Division, holding the sector to our south, or perhaps the artillery positions further back. The Soviets have a great deal of ammunition, more than we do. They can afford to fire even without hitting anything. We must save every round. Dries has assembled his rifle. He sets it down, lights a hand-rolled cigarette rolled with Makora, the rough Russian tobacco we take from the dead Soviets. He offers me one. I decline. The lungs are already bad enough from the dust and powder smoke. He shrugs and smokes alone. After a time, he asks me what I'm writing. I tell him I'm making notes. For whom, he asks. I don't know, I answer. For posterity? For myself? For the dead who can no longer speak? He laughs briefly, a short, dry, humorless laugh. Posterity, he says, won't be interested in us. We are just soldiers, small men in great wars. No one will remember us. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps these notes will never be read. Perhaps they will rot in a shelter on the banks of the Mius beside my body when the next Soviet offensive comes and sweeps us away. Perhaps one day I will carry them home to a Holland I no longer quite know and hide them in a drawer where no one will find them. Perhaps it does not matter. I keep writing all the same. It is my way of dealing with the madness. It is the only path I know. The candle gutters in the draft that enters through the cracks in the shelter. The darkness advances, fills the corners, devours the light. The Mius cannot be heard. It flows too silently for all it has witnessed. But the smell of the river water enters when the wind shifts fresh and muddy. A smell of life in the midst of so much death. To the east, a Soviet searchlight begins to sweep the sky, a long white finger probing the clouds. Somewhere a dog barks a stray animal that survived in the ruins of a village. Normal sounds of the night at the front. The war has its own routines, its own rhythms. We have learned to live within them. This morning word came by teleprinter that the division will be transferred north at the beginning of September to the Kharkov region, where the situation has become critical. The Soviets' Operation Rumiantsev has torn deep gaps in the German lines. Belgorod has fallen. Kharkov is threatened. Army Group South is assembling every available reserve to stabilize the front. We will fight again in another place against the same enemy. The cycle begins again, but that is still a week away. Until then, we hold the Mius, our small river, our small corner of the front. We strengthen the positions, integrate the reinforcements, rest as much as possible. We wait for the next attack, which will come sooner or later, and when it comes, we will fight as we have always fought to the end. SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Schmidt of the 3rd Westland Battalion received the Knight's Cross on 4 August for his personal conduct during the fighting at Stepanovka. He had destroyed 2 Soviet armored vehicles with a Hafladung and repelled a counterattack when his company was close to collapse. A brave officer, one of the best I know. He will go on fighting, as all of us go on, until the war ends or until we fall. I blow out the candle now. The darkness will be complete, black and mute. My fingers smell of wax and cheap pencil lead, and underneath that, the gunpowder embedded in the skin that no water can remove. I will try to sleep a few hours before dawn comes, and a new day begins. One more day at war. One more day in the 3rd year of Operation Barbarossa. One more day on the Mius in the summer of '43. While the world burns, tomorrow I will rise, clean my weapon, check the men, inspect the positions. I will show the new reinforcements how to repair a trench, how to set up a machine gun, how to take cover under artillery fire. I will do what an Unterscharfer does day after day until I can no more. And if the Soviets attack, if the artillery thunders and the tanks advance and the infantry shouts and charges, then I will fight as I have always fought, as all of us have fought in this endless war that has no end in sight. This is my account. This is my testimony. It is all I have to say. The fighting on the Mius continues. The division holds its positions on the western bank of the river in the trenches and shelters we paid for with our blood. The men wait, sleep, eat, clean their weapons, write letters. Some pray, some swear. Most say nothing. We wait for the next order. It will come as all orders come. and we will obey as we have always obeyed, because that is what soldiers do. That is what we are. Subscribe to Iron Dominion, and we'll see you in the next one.